Good evening. I'm David Sturrock, Chairman of the Political Science Department here at Southwest Minnesota State University, and also head of the Government Affairs Committee of the Marshall Area Chamber of Commerce. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to our legislative candidates debate for 2012 for the State Senate and State House. This comes to you from the Conference Center on the campus of SMSU. A special welcome to those of us joining us on KMHL Radio, AM 1400, and through KSSU Television Community Access, sponsored by Southwest State University. In 1992, the Political Science Association, a student club here at SMSU, began to host these candidate debates. So we're marking our 20th year of it now. In 1998, we were pleased to have the Marshall Area Chamber of Commerce join us as a co-sponsor to make this something based in and open to not only the campus but the entire community. Our partnership is committed to informing the voters of our region as they prepare to choose their state legislators on the November 6th election. Our thanks to KMHL AM 1400, the SMSU Radio TV Club, and the National Broadcasting Society for making possible our broadcast coverage tonight. And now, let's meet tonight's moderators. The panel for State Senate District 16 will be moderated by sociology professor Vicki Brockman, who is also president of the SMSU Faculty Association. Political science professor Douglas Simon will moderate the debate for House District 16A, which will begin at 8 o'clock, and he is vice president of the Faculty Association. So we thank you both very much for your representation of the faculty for our program tonight. We will begin, quite right. We will begin with Professor Brockman.
Good evening and welcome to the next panel of our 2012 Legislative Candidates Debate. We will now hear from the candidates for State Senate District 16. The newly drawn district includes portions of Brown, Lac-qui-Parle, Lyon, Redwood Falls, Renville, and Yellow Medicine counties. We'll begin with 90-second opening statements, followed by questions from the audience and our media panel, and we'll finish with closing statements of 2 minutes each. Our media panelist is Per Peterson, editor of the Marshall Independent. If you have questions for the candidates, please take a card from one of the ushers from the Political Science Association. Can you wave those cards? Okay, they're coming. They will gather your questions and deliver them to our panelists, who will select questions of general interest and relevance to this election. And now, meet the candidates for Senate District 16 in alphabetical order. They are Gary Dahms, candidate of the Republican Party who lives near Redwood Falls, and Democratic Farmer Labor candidate Ted Suss, who lives near Wabasso. And now, our opening statements. Candidates, you will have 90 seconds. Please be alert to our timekeeper, Steve Halloran, president of the Political Science Association, who will signal when you're down to 30 seconds, and then 10 seconds, and 0 seconds. And where are you sitting, Steve? Right over here. Maybe you should move over so that people can see a little better. And audience, please help us by refraining from audible expressions of approval or disapproval so we can devote as much time as possible to the candidates. The order of speaking was determined by draw and begins with Ted Suss. Now for your opening statements.
Thank you, Dr. Brockman. And thank you to all of the people who are here tonight and to the people listening on the radio. Thank you to the university and the chamber for sponsoring this event. It's not possible for me to remember all of the people that I need to thank between the various associations, so I'll leave it at that. My name is Ted Suss, and I'm a candidate for the State Senate in District 16. I just retired in July from the position as superintendent of schools in the Wabasso Public School District, where I served for 9 years. Prior to that, I was superintendent in Hendricks and Ivanhoe for 3 years. I've spent most of my adult life, my work career, in education. I served as the executive director of the Minnesota State Board of Education for 5 years, and I was a member of the House of Representatives in the 1970s for 4 years, serving on the House Education Committee, along with a couple of other committees, the Judiciary Committee, the Agriculture Committee, and the Financial Institutions and Insurance Committee. But most of my career has been in education. I decided to run for the legislature during the state government shutdown last summer. To me, that state government shutdown was proof positive that our legislature is broken and needs to be fixed. The inability of the legislature to truly balance the budget is another indication that the legislature is broken and needs to be fixed. Time's about up. We'll talk about these issues later, but again, thank you for attending.
Thank you, Mr. Suss. And now we hear from Gary Dahms.
Well, first I'd like to thank the Marshall Chamber and the Southwest State here for hosting this event. And Professor Brockman, thank you for being the moderator. I am Senator Gary Dahms. Currently I represent the Senate District 21, and I'm up for re-election in Senate District 16. I've been very fortunate over the years to be able to serve on several committees and foundations in my community, dealing with agriculture, education, health and human services, transportation, economic development, and soil and water. I've owned and operated the Dahms Insurance Agency for approximately 25 years, and I just retired last January. Prior to becoming a senator, I was a Redwood County Commissioner, where I served as the vice chair. In the Senate, I serve in the Environmental and Natural Resources Committee, the Commerce Committee, and the Agricultural Committee, where I am the vice chair. As a business owner, I know what it is to meet payroll, to balance budgets, and to deal on a daily basis with the overburdening government regulations. And that experience, along with my experience of being a county commissioner, has helped me to be a senator. It's been an opportunity and a pleasure to serve as your senator for the past 2 years, and I'd appreciate the opportunity to continue to serve for the next 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we move on to questions from our panel. Candidates, you have 90 seconds to respond to each question, and you can take less if you wish. We'll alternate the order in which you respond. Panelist, your first question, please.
With Minnesota facing a long-term structural imbalance in its budget, and given the history of balancing the budget with short-term solutions that have included borrowing from our schools, are there more permanent fixes that can be used to help get and keep the state in the black?
Ted, your response, please. Should we just take them from there? Or?
Whatever you prefer. We'll just stay here. Be less up and down if we stay seated. As I said in my opening comments, the state budget needs to be balanced. It needs to be balanced on the long term. As I think everyone in the state knows, the budget was balanced, euphemistically balanced, I would say, during this last biennium by borrowing about $700 million, putting it into the checking account, by sending an IOU to the school districts of $2.4 billion, by draining the rainy day fund and the cash flow accounts. You know, that can only happen once. Time is at hand to balance the budget for real. One thing that needs to happen, obviously, is that every dollar spent needs to be spent wisely. Every bit of waste needs to be cut out of government spending. We need to look for efficiencies. But the bottom line is, in order to balance the budget permanently, we are going to need to look at some new sources of revenue. I think that's an excellent opportunity to bring about some tax reform that's fair to the middle class. Right now, the middle class is paying more than its fair share in taxes. We can accomplish two things at the same time, and that is we can balance the budget permanently and bring about fairness in our tax structure by accomplishing tax reform as well as balancing the budget.
Gary Dahms?
Well, we need to balance the budget, and we need to do it by growing jobs. When we grow jobs, we grow stability. And if we want to have a stability economic turnaround and we want to make that stable, we need to grow jobs in rural Minnesota as well as in all of Minnesota. In order to do that, we need to make sure that we have a job-friendly climate, that we attract new businesses to come to Minnesota, and that we keep them here and we allow them to expand here. And in order to do that, we have to create an environment that's friendly from a tax standpoint. We have to make sure that we have a baseload energy system that the commercial folks can use at a reasonable price. And we have to make sure that our children are educated with a cutting-edge education that gives them the skill sets we need in order to grow those jobs and keep those people in those jobs. And we need to make sure we have a transportation system that allows these people to move their goods and commodities in and out of the rural areas. I think the best way to get new revenue is to grow jobs in the private sector. Those jobs are paid for by the goods and services they produce. And the income tax that comes off of that goes into the state budget, into the state general fund, which can help us take care of some of the budget issues.
Next question. Roads and bridges continue to be a major concern in every corner of Minnesota. How do you propose the infrastructure issues be addressed in the coming years?
Gary Dahms, your response.
Well, I think first of all, I certainly feel that the system we have in place now with the gas tax and the Minnesota sales tax on automobiles and the license fees certainly is a good start. I think we also need to look at cooperating in some coalition or collaboration with our cities and with our communities and our private industry when it comes to some of these projects. I think in the cities we can be looking at some of the MinPass proposals. But I think the other thing we have to do is to make sure that we have a system to where we're allowing the maximum use of the dollars that we have for our roads and bridges. We started 2 years ago by streamlining the permitting process, and we need to continue to work on that. About 30% of what we spend is spent on qualifying for rules and regulations and stuff like that. And I understand that we need to be conscious of our natural resources and things, and I believe that we need to do that. But I think that we can do it more efficiently and more effectively and get more out of the dollars that we're spending on our transportation. And I think, like I said, we need to look at some collaborations for some stability in our transportation dollars.
Ted Suss, your response.
I think it's apparent to everyone that our roads and bridges are crumbling. The snowplows don't run as often as the wintertime. The roads are no longer up to the maximum usability. We had a meeting here in town about a month ago, and a woman from Minneota talked about how the wider farm equipment is making the narrow shoulders on Highway 68 a real safety hazard because the tractor or the combine needs to sit over the center line in order to go down the road. We need to upgrade our highway system, and that's going to take money. It's going to take a lot of effort. One thing I would like to suggest is that we look at the possibility of selling bonds to build new roads, to upgrade our bridges, and then look at some additional revenue streams, whether it be an additional gas tax or some sort of a fee for vehicles that don't use gasoline. We now have electric cars that don't pay any gasoline tax. But if we sell bonds, we've got construction companies right now that are looking for work. You drive by the major construction companies and their cranes and their trucks are sitting. We've got construction workers looking for work. Interest is at an all-time low. We could sell bonds, get this economy going with the additional construction jobs, and at the same time upgrade our roads and bridges, make 23 a 4-lane.
The ballot for Marshall residents in November includes a sales tax option with revenue going toward a proposed amateur sports complex and expansion at the Merit Training Center. Will you support efforts to gain state funding to further support these projects?
Ted Suss, your response.
I've already pledged to the folks that are promoting the Merit Center and the sports facility that I will introduce bonding legislation. I will push for hearings on those bills and do my level best to get them into the final bonding bill. In order to have that happen, we need to have a state senator from this area that will support a bonding bill that is big enough to meet the needs all over the state. We can't just expect to get our projects funded and everybody else stand aside and not get their projects funded. But I will introduce that bonding legislation. I will push for its inclusion in the final bonding bill, and I'll support the bonding bill when it comes before the Senate.
Gary Dahms, your response, please.
I did author the bill in the Senate last year to carry the bonding bill for the merit in the sports center, and I also authored the bill to carry for the sales tax, the Minnesota to pass it so that if the city decided to have it on the ballot and it passes, it would be acceptable at the state. I did carry both of those bills, and Chief authored those, and I certainly will continue to support, if that sales tax referendum passes in Marshall, I will consider to do my level best to help with the bonding for the project.
Okay, a question from the audience. How has your past experience prepared you to work with legislators on both sides of the aisle?
Gary Dahms, please.
Well, I think I'd just like to say that my record reflects that I do that. If I take a look at the number of bills that I passed in my first legislative session, the majority of those bills have bipartisan co-authors. And I've made that a habit of working across the aisle with both sides, the DFL and the Republicans, to make sure that I get bills put together that, number one, are good for the district, good for the state, and that I've got support on both sides of the aisle, and I will continue to do that. We do hear a lot of talk about how partisan things are, and there are certain areas that it gets very partisan, and that's when you get to the bonding or to the budgeting bill, it gets very partisan. And we just need to keep working to make sure that we do the best we can. We cooperate and compromise where we can, and my record reflects that I do that.
Ted Suss, your response, please.
That's actually been the major center point of my campaign since I started running last winter, and that is that we need to change the culture of the legislature and make it a more bipartisan, cooperative, and collaborative organization. We can't have legislators who refuse to negotiate because they don't feel that that's permissible within their party structure. As far as my past experience goes, I believe sitting down at a negotiating table when you're management and negotiating a labor relations agreement with teachers and support staff, and I've negotiated about 25 contracts where you've got to get the best deal for the taxpayer and the school board, but you also need to leave that negotiating table with a working relationship that not only allows but encourages the employees to come back to work tomorrow and pour their heart and soul into doing their job. I've done that successfully. I've done that year after year, and I believe those skills and those experiences will suit me well for being a legislator who makes it possible for the Senate and the House. Only the Senate I'll be at, but maybe we'll set a good example and the House will follow our example. But I believe I can provide some of the leadership that's needed to make the legislature a more cooperative, collaborative body.
Next question is a two-part question, so bear with me a little bit. This year's ballot includes 2 proposed constitutional amendments. The first part of the question is, what is your stance on amendments in general? Is there a place for them, or in your view, are they nothing more than an intrusion on what should be part of the legislative process? The second part of the question, please provide a thumbnail personal view on the voter ID and marriage amendments. In other words, are you for or against these amendments?
Your response, Ted Suss.
The purpose of the Constitution is to provide the framework for government, to delineate the powers between the branches of government, and to protect the rights of citizens from government. The purpose of the Constitution is not to set public policy. It's the designing document for our framework of government. The constitutional amendment process should only be used when necessary to change the structure of government or to protect the rights of citizens from government. Using that as a base philosophy, it's easy for me to oppose both the constitutional amendment because, as I believe the question said, an intrusion on the legislative process or something to that effect. These matters should be taken care of through the legislative process, which is also spelled out in the Constitution, that a bill needs to be introduced and passed in the House, it needs to be introduced and passed in the Senate, and it needs to be signed by the governor to become state law. We already have a defense of marriage law on the books, so the defense of marriage constitutional amendment is unnecessary. The voter ID, in my opinion, is nothing more than an attempt to disenfranchise legally qualified voters who might, on the day of the election, not have a valid ID. That is not something that is as rare as one thinks. I've had numerous people, usually senior citizens, ask me if they need a voter ID this year because they don't have one that's valid. Their driver's license might be expired, or maybe they've moved and they haven't renewed it yet.
Your response.
Well, first of all, I think that the legislators have an obligation to legislate and pass laws. And I think that we do that. And I think we do a good job at that. But I think there are times to where it's permissible to put constitutional amendments on the ballot. And I support these 2 constitutional amendments on the ballot. Since Minnesota became a state in 1858, we've had 213 constitutional amendments put on the ballot. We've had 17 constitutional amendments put on the ballot since 1980. Just because a constitutional amendment is put on the ballot doesn't mean it's going to pass. What it means to me is that the legislators have taken a look at that piece of legislation or that policy and said, you know, this is a type of policy that not only should we allow the general public or the constituents of Minnesota to debate and discuss, but we also ought to let them have an opportunity to help shape that policy. So that would be my answer to the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, do I support voter ID and the marriage amendments? I support both the voter ID and the marriage amendments, and I believe that the voter ID amendment will bring some integrity to the voting system. I know in rural Minnesota we have a good system, but I just think that people need to know when they go vote that their vote's not being offset by a ballot that's not there legally.
Okay, next couple questions are education related. We'll start with higher ed. Many employers are facing a continuing shortage of qualified workers for available jobs. How should the state address this workforce skills gap? And what must be done to assure that our higher education system is preparing workers for the available jobs in today's economy?
Your response, Gary Dahms.
Well, I think first of all, in Minnesota, I was at a conference at the Humphrey Institute in January, and they were talking about we could reduce unemployment by about 1.5% if we could match the available jobs with the skill sets that are necessary. So we certainly have an issue there. So I think that we need to continue to work on funding for job retraining so we can get folks retrained to have the skills that we have jobs out there for. And I also think that we need to start looking at the technical, vocational areas, the heating, the plumbing, air conditioning, things like that. We're going to face a severe shortage of folks in that industry when this economy starts really turning around. And I think that we need to start dealing with that now. And I think at the high school level, we need to start introducing some more VOTEC programs. And at the college level, continue those programs so that we can get people into those fields. And the same way with machinists. We have a lot of opportunities in the machinist field right now, but we have a hard time filling those jobs. So I think we have to look at taking a look at what jobs, what type of jobs that are available out there, where we need to get our students educated and fill those needs.
Your response, Ted Suss.
The job skills mismatch is a national problem. There are jobs available all over this country and all over Minnesota, but there aren't people properly trained, properly skilled to fill them where the jobs are located. And changing that to a situation where we have a skilled workforce to fill those jobs is vitally important. You don't do it by cutting funding for the post-secondary education system, and you don't do it by cutting funding for the public schools or by holding funding flat so that after inflation you actually have a net loss of available funds. We need to expand the course offerings at the vocational technical schools. We need to give universities like Southwest Minnesota State University the resources to expand programs when a need arises. By cutting the funding of the post-secondary system, we also cut into the jobs-friendly nature of our state. What automated manufacturer is going to locate jobs in rural Minnesota if we don't have a skilled workforce? The answer to that is to properly fund our post-secondary system. You know, when I was a superintendent of schools and I saw vocational training programs in the high schools being cut, again, because of budget constraints. They're expensive programs and low numbers. That's what would get cut. We need to properly fund our education system to make those trained workers available to businesses to hire.
The next question deals with K through 12. Minnesota has one of the widest achievement gaps between white and minority students. How do you propose correcting this problem, And what specifically would you do to improve K through 12 education in Minnesota?
Ted Suss, your response?
That's almost two separate questions, the achievement gap and improving K-12 education in Minnesota. I'll say this on the improving education in general. The last 2 years, the legislature enacted more mandates and requirements than I have seen in 30 years in being involved in education. Every time a paperwork mandate comes along, money is taken from the classroom and put into administration. Almost every school district in the state of Minnesota is looking at having to increase its administrative staffing to handle the new mandates that were created by the legislature in the last 2 years. I am absolutely convinced, and I trust local elected boards of education to hire trained administrators, and I trust that they will offer the best possible education to the students in those communities. There's no greater accountability system going than parents walking into the classroom or walking into a school board meeting or talking to a school administrator demanding quality education for their children. As to the achievement gap, there are so many programs now. We just need to focus on giving teachers the skills they need to address students who come from homes where they may not speak English, where the parents may not be literate, where the attendance might be so sketchy that it's hard for the kids to participate in class because they were absent so many days last week. That's just something that everyone needs to work on.
Gary Dahms, your response, please.
Well, first of all, I think that in education in Minnesota, I think the first thing we have to do, and we started on it in the last 2 years, is reducing mandates to the local schools, and we have to continue to work very hard to reduce those mandates. We have to get the control back at the local level. The school board, the administrators, and the teachers are the ones that need to draw up the education plan on how they're going to teach children in their school and how they're going to give those children the best education. And I think that also somewhat addresses the achievement gap. I think that too many times the bureaucrats in St. Paul try to determine a system that's going to work and that one size does not fit all. Let's let the local school systems determine what is the best way to use their dollars to educate the children in our local schools. And as far as funding is concerned, what we've done the last 2 years is last year we increased the funding $50 per pupil last year and this year, and also in rural Minnesota we had small schools funding, and that funding did help quite a few of our small schools, and it ranged anywhere, in our district here, it ranged anywhere from about $40 to about $618 per enrolled pupil in our small schools of under 1,000 students. So I think, again, it's all about local control, getting the control back to the school boards, reducing the mandates, and letting them come up with a program that best educates our children.
This is the 2012 legislative candidate debate coming to you from Southwest Minnesota State University over KMHL AM 1400 in Marshall and KSSU TV.
Another question from the audience. How would you reform LGA to benefit small rural communities?
Gary Dahms, please respond.
Well, I think one thing that's happened with the LGA is we saw in 2007, 8, and 9, LGA was going down, and so in 2000 and in 2010, so in 2011 in the legislative session, we did pass legislation that would hold LGA, stabilize it at its 2010 level, and it stayed there in 2012 and in 2013. But we do realize that the funding formula is not a formula that's working real well, and LGA has not been funded to 100% for some time to the certified amount. So what we did in 2011 is that we appointed a legislative bipartisan committee to go ahead and start looking at LGA. They've been looking at LGA for 2011 and 2012. And they will be reporting back to the legislature in 2013 with what they see in LGA, what some of the funding things are, and what some of the improvements we could do to help LGA in our rural communities. LGA was originally designed in about 1971, I believe, and that was to make sure that our small communities could take care of the basic needs And it's LGA is a matter of matching the needs with your ability to pay for those needs through taxation. And many of our small communities don't have the tax base they need. So the LGA helps them provide those basic services. And so we need to make sure we protect LGA and that we do take a look at LGA and maybe redo the formula so we get a better shake out here for our rural communities.
Ted Suss, your response, please.
I think everybody in this room probably knows what LGA stands for, but there may be people watching or listening that don't. The LGA stands for Local Government Aid. That is money that's collected by the state and paid back to local units of government, cities and counties, to help them fund city operations or county operations. The school districts have a very similar situation. We call that general education revenue. The key element of LGA is that those communities that don't have the tax capacity, in other words, if you have a community that's all it's all houses, there's no big commercial industrial, you don't have a nuclear power plant, you don't have a large factory that pays a lot of property taxes, whether it's a small community or a large community, a community like that has a great difficulty raising enough funds through property taxes to fund its operations. The LGA formula was created to equalize that so that every community in the state had the opportunity to provide the services that that community and the citizens of that community need and deserve. Most communities in our district are receiving less LGA now than they were receiving 10 years ago. That means property taxes go up. We need to remedy that situation. If a dollar is going to be collected in tax, it doesn't really make any difference whether it's collected from the state, by the state, or the local unit of government in terms of tax burden, but the property tax is a very unfair way to collect that, and we should be funding LGA to reduce property taxes.
What specific tax increases, if any, do you support for education and infrastructure?
Ted Suss, your response, please.
As I stated earlier, I believe we need to look at increasing the revenue available to the Department of Transportation to rebuild our roads and bridges. And I would be open to a gas tax increase. I would be open to a tax on vehicles that don't use fossil fuel. And we need to also take a look at anything else that's available. There's a person here in the audience, Cal Brink, I saw him walking around, who's on a governor-appointed blue ribbon task force that's examining that issue at the present time. And I'm expecting that task force to bring forth some excellent recommendations. We can have a choice. We can have good roads, or we can stay with the current revenue stream. We can't have both. As far as funding for education, as I said earlier, we need tax reform that's fair to the middle class. The middle class right now is paying significantly more than its fair share in taxes, and in the process of tax reform, we can raise some additional revenue simply by asking the people that are now paying less than their fair share to pay their fair share. And that money obviously can be used for K-12 education, for local government aid, for property tax relief, for aid to higher education.
Would you repeat the question?
Gary Dahms, please respond. Repeat the question, please.
What specific tax increases, if any, do you support for education and infrastructure?
Thank you. First of all, I don't think that during a recession is a time to raise taxes. I think that's a time to make sure we create jobs. I believe we need to raise revenue, but not raise taxes. So let's raise revenue by growing jobs in Minnesota. And we can do that. We've reduced unemployment by nearly 2% in the last 2 years, and we need to continue on that track. And when we grow those jobs in the private industry, those jobs are paid for by the goods and services that they produce. And that generates income tax that we can then take to the general fund. And we can use that for education, for transportation, and areas like that. So I think that that's what we really need to focus on. We need to focus on growing jobs in rural Minnesota.
I'll use that answer as a segue to the next question. On unemployment, Minnesota continues to rank positively compared to the national rate. How can we as a state maintain that strong ranking and perhaps lower it in the years to come?
Gary Dahms, your response, please.
Well, first of all, I think, again, like I said earlier, we need to make sure that we create a positive environment for business. We need to draw business here, keep them here, and allow them to grow here. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that we have an infrastructure and transportation that's good. We need to make sure our education system is giving our children the cutting-edge education and giving them the skill sets that we need to meet the jobs that we have. We need to make sure we have a tax policy that invites businesses to Minnesota and keeps them here. And we need to make sure that we have a streamlined permitting process and rules and regulations that are friendly to business. Now, with that said, I understand we still need to make sure we take care of our environmental and natural resources, and I fully understand that. But I think we need to look at the efficiencies that we can to make sure that we can keep our businesses here and get them to grow jobs. And I think with that, when we can grow those jobs, then we can increase our revenues in the state general fund.
Ted Suss, your response, please.
Minnesota has, for about the last 40 years, enjoyed unemployment rates below the national average. Not every month, but most of the time. And every study that's been made credits one thing for that, and that is that we have always had a highly skilled, highly educated workforce. We do need to make sure that we have a business-friendly tax and regulatory structure in Minnesota. I understand regulations. As a superintendent of schools, I spent hours and hours and hours filling out forms and gathering data to comply with regulations, spending what I thought was unnecessary money to comply with regulations. But we need to also make sure that what we say during the campaign matches what we do when we're in St. Paul in the legislature. As I said before, the level of regulation skyrocketed on schools during the last 2 years. We've got entire new regulatory regimes that are requiring school districts to spend more money. The same thing is the case for business. We need to train workers so that businesses want to locate here and can expand here. The major change that was made in the tax policy during the last 2 years was to repeal the homestead credit. And anyone that understands the interrelationship of our tax laws in this state could tell immediately that that was going to dramatically increase commercial industrial property taxes, which it did. That's hardly the way to come up with a positive business climate.
What steps would you take to improve the function of Minnesota's legislature?
Ted Suss, your response, please.
This is something that I've been talking about for the last couple of years, and I will outline my plan for improving the legislature. And this is not something that one legislator can handle single-handedly, but it's really kind of a two-level process. Number one, and that is, how does the legislator act as an individual? And number two, what can that legislator do to change the institution? The day after the election, assuming I win, I'm going to send a letter to every Republican member of the state Senate asking them to meet with me between November 7th and when we convene in January, whether it's breakfast, lunch, dinner, his office, her office, my office, any place, meet to start to develop and build a personal relationship. People work together when they know each other and like each other and respect each other. That's one tangible thing that I, as an individual legislator, can do. But more importantly, we need to change the culture of the legislature to one where negotiation, collaboration, and cooperation is an expectation, not something that's avoided and considered a negative. And the only way that's going to happen is for the legislature to go through an institutional change process similar to what major corporations do. We're running out of time, so I can't give my whole lecture, but maybe we'll get back to it.
Gary Dahms, your response, please.
Well, I think that, there's two parts to this question that the way I see it. First of all, there is a lot of bipartisanship that does go on, but we get into, it seems like, the budgeting, and that's where we get into a real problem with compromise and stuff like that. We do have to work very hard in building relationships and working across the aisle, and that's all part of being a legislator. And I don't think anybody goes into the legislation to be a legislator thinking that they're not going to do that or to go there not to do that. we go there with the intentions of doing that, and we work very hard to get that done. And I worked very hard the last 2 years of building relationships and going across the aisle and bringing people in to get them to support bills that I have sponsored and things like that. But we just have to work harder. I think it's not just in Minnesota, it's kind of a national issue. And I think what's happening is in both parties, we've got people way off to the sides, and we need to kind of work with the middle, bring those folks in and try to build better relationships and work harder on compromise and work harder in getting legislation passed that's good for the state and the district.
What one personal trait differentiates you from your opponent?
Gary Dahms, your response, please.
Well, I think my experience is different than what Ted's is, and I have experience in business as well as experience as a county commissioner. And I think that experience helps me when it comes to the legislation, to the Senate. I think it helps me pass good legislation that's good for the district because of my broad experience and background.
Ted Suss, your response, please.
I don't know if personal traits, if I know Gary well enough to know what his personal traits are, or if he knows me well enough to know my personal traits. But my experience has been as a superintendent of the schools is very similar to being an executive or the owner of a small business. You've got to develop the budget. You got to live within your means. You have to supervise staff. You know, I've fired teachers. They say you can't do it. I've done it. I have negotiated labor relations agreements, but I've also worked on both the state and national level on development of public policy. I served as a member of the board of directors of the National Association of State Boards of Education. And when I was the executive director of the Minnesota State Board of Education, we had oversight responsibility and regulatory responsibility for all of the public schools in the state of Minnesota. And it was my responsibility to work with the State Board of Education to guide them to govern the schools in the way that was least intrusive, that allowed the schools to operate with the greatest amount of freedom. But you know, I've met a payroll, I've balanced budgets, I've worked with people across the negotiating table, people that had diametrically opposed views to mine, and yet we worked together. I've learned, you know, it takes time to learn how to work with people. And I think my experience is probably the most valuable thing that I'll take to St. Paul.
Is Minnesota doing enough to diversify its energy generation portfolio?
Ted Suss, your response, please.
I think, you know, Minnesota is a national leader in wind energy, and we are a leader in a whole range of startup companies, most in the wind, but in solar and some other areas. So I believe Minnesota has done a good job of diversifying its alternative energy production capacity. We have a mandate that requires the utilities to purchase a certain amount of their base load from green energy sources. Minnesota has been a leader in the ethanol industry. I think, though, we're just at the start of that. There is a tremendous field out there to be tilled, and the legislature needs to create an environment where alternative energy research and development is encouraged, and we need to continue to lead the nation in such things as wind, and we need to probably ratchet up our efforts in solar. But there are some other biofuels that we're really just beginning to bring online. I think Minnesota deserves to pat itself on the back for having done a great job in alternative energy, and we just need to continue that.
Gary Dahms, your response, please.
I think we're doing a good job. That don't mean that we can't do better. I think that we certainly have our mark as far as on a national basis as to what we're accomplishing, what we're doing. We take a look at wind energy. We're certainly doing a lot there, and solar and with ethanol. And we're always looking at new opportunities. There's a lot of research going on. We have the Next Energy Board that they're always looking at new opportunities. And so there's a lot going on in Minnesota with energy, and I think we need to keep moving that forward because we need to have a good alternative sustainable energy system in Minnesota and a nation as well. So I think we've got a good start, but we have to keep working forward and keep moving that forward.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay. What can the legislature do to decrease college tuition and debt?
Gary, your response, please.
Well, what we have done in the last 2 years is last year we didn't reduce college tuition, but what we did do is we added another $20.9 million into the student grant program, student aid. We've also increased the work study program by about 3%. And we need to continue along those paths, and we need to make sure that we have an efficient system. And we did ask for the administration at the MnSCU at the upper level to take a 10% cut up there, because we feel that it was a little heavy up on that end, but we do feel that we need to make sure we have our professors at our colleges and stuff so that we can maintain a good student to professor ratio. And we just have to make sure we have a stable funding path so that we can keep the tuition flat or at a reasonable amount. And I think along with that, again, it's very important that not only do we have a reasonable tuition, but that when our students graduate, we have a job for them. And that's the other part of the coin. We have to have reasonable tuition. We have to have a job so they can pay back their student loans when they get out.
Ted Suss, your response, please.
We need to properly fund the post-secondary system. Most of the professors at the school here have had a pay freeze for about the last 3 years, and yet tuition is skyrocketing. The system hasn't been properly funded by the legislature. When tuition goes up, that's money collected by government to provide a service. To me, that's a form of a tax. So we've had a tax increase. We had some pretty big tax increases the last few years in the form of tuition increases. We need to properly fund the post-secondary system so that we can pay the staff and not have the tuition go up. I'd like to see us freeze tuition and then provide sufficient funds to the system so that the system can operate effectively and efficiently. As far as student debt, I don't, quite frankly, have an answer to that, other than that if somebody has a good suggestion, I would certainly entertain talking about it. I hate to see students. I've had students come up to me, superintendent of schools, walking up and down the hallways every day talking to high school kids. I started having students come up to me these last couple of years saying, Mr. Suss, I don't think I'm going to go to four-year college because my family can't afford it. And we can't have that. We can't afford to pass on every child getting the absolute best education we can give them.
Thank you, panelists and candidates. It's now time for your closing statements, which will be given in reverse order of your opening statements. Gary Dahms, your 2-minute closing statement, please.
Well, first of all, again, I'd like to thank the university here and the Marshall Chamber for hosting this event, and Professor Brockman for moderating, and for you folks for taking time out of your day to attend. When I was first elected to the Senate 2 years ago, Minnesota faced a $6 billion deficit. Today we have over $1 billion surplus. We reduced unemployment by nearly 2%. Last month was one of the first months to where people noticed that their amount they're paying for their mortgage in relationship to their take-home pay has started to decrease as a percentage from when the recession first started. We're also seeing the value of homes go up and the sales of homes going up. I feel that Minnesota's economy is on a rebound, but I feel we have a lot of work left to do. And in order to do that, I feel we need to create jobs in Minnesota. I think once we get past balancing the budget, the next most important thing is creating jobs. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that we have a good program in Minnesota that attracts new businesses, keeps them here, and gets the ones that are here to grow and create jobs. And in order to do this, we need to make sure that we have a tax-friendly program for the businesses. We need to make sure that our education system matches the skill sets needed with the jobs that are available. And we need to have a transportation system that allows us to move our goods and services. And we need to make sure that we have a permitting system that is streamlined and moves well. I would like the opportunity to continue to see Minnesota move forward and Minnesota grow. I would like the opportunity to take my leadership skills, my experience, and my rural values back to St. Paul and move Minnesota forward. However, in order for me to do that, I need your help, and I'm asking for your vote on November 6th. Thank you, good evening, and God bless you.
Thank you, Gary Dahms. Ted Suss, your closing statement, please.
Hate to move you out of the way. Thank you to the university, to the Chamber of Commerce, to the radio and television stations, and to the student associations for sponsoring the event, and thank you to each of you for attending, and thank you to the people who are viewing and listening at home. Just one comment. We don't have a balanced budget. We're looking at a $1.2 billion deficit when the legislature starts in January. That's without paying back the shift to the schools, which is $2.4 billion, and that's with no inflation in expenditures. If you add in the shift and you add in inflation, we actually have a budget deficit of about $4.5 billion day one of the new legislative session. The budget deficit started at $6 billion in November, but by the February forecast, and the February forecast is the forecast that the legislature used to balance the budget, was $5 billion. Now, do you remember how angry you were last summer during the state government shutdown? You were angry because the legislature didn't do its job. The legislature couldn't balance the budget. I would ask for your vote to go to St. Paul to create a new way of acting in the legislature. That is to make cooperation, collaboration, and negotiation the norm, not the exception. Everybody can sit here and say, oh, we cooperate. It's like having a lawnmower. You know, you start it up on the driveway and it purrs beautifully. You push it into the tall grass and it dies. That's the way the legislature's been running. It just purrs on the simple bills changing the definition of an insurance company. But when you get into the tough stuff, you get into balancing the budget, passing a bonding bill, properly funding education, both K-12 and post-secondary, the legislature, just like that lawnmower, it dies. I ask for your vote. Thank you.
This concludes our debate for Senate District 16. Our thanks to the candidates, Gary Dahms and Ted Suss. I'm Vicki Brockman, and I've been your moderator for this debate. We'll be taking a short pause as the next panelists take their place. Our program will resume at 8 p.m. sharp. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll be hearing from the candidates for State House District 16A. If you have a question for the candidates, please take a card from one of the ushers from the Political Science Association. Could those folks, could you wave your cards? They will gather your questions and deliver them to your panelists, who will select questions of general interest and relevance to this election. And now, let's meet the candidates for House District 16A in alphabetical order. They are Al Kruse from the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, who lives near Marshall, and Republican Chris Swedzinski, who lives near Ghent. It's time for opening statements. Candidates, you'll have 90 seconds. Please alert our timekeeper, Steve Halloran, who is the president of the Political Science Association, who is sitting in the first row. He will signal when you're down to 30 seconds, then 10 seconds, and 0 seconds. Audience, please help us by refraining from audible expressions of approval or disapproval, so we can devote as much time as possible to our candidates. The order of speaking was determined by draw and begins with Mr. Kruse. Thank you, and Mr. Kruse, you may have your opening statement.
I want to thank Professor Sturrock, the SMSU Political Science Department, the Marshall Area Chamber of Commerce, and all others who made this event possible. My name is Al Kruse. I grew up on a farm in Lincoln County. I graduated from SMSU here in Marshall. For 12 years, I worked to empower individuals by helping them to find a career. I knew from that experience that government can be efficient and effective. I sold insurance and investments, and from that experience, I learned that you want a defined benefit plan when you retire. I also spent many years as a manufacturer's rep selling and marketing farm machinery through a several state area. And from that experience, I learned how to manage time, money, and people. I also learned the value of a modern and safe transportation system of roads and bridges. I graduated from the Marshall Leadership Academy and served 6 years on the Marshall Library Board, 2 as president, during which time I helped facilitate the building of a new library. Now I am running to be your state representative in District 16A. At least 26 members of the current legislature have signed a no-tax pledge. This pledge makes a balanced approach to the budget impossible. Future government shutdowns are unacceptable, and borrowing from our schools does not lead to a balanced budget. I am unencumbered by pledges or loyalties, and I ask for you to send me to St. Paul to help Minnesota work again.
Thank you, Mr. Kruse. We will now hear from Mr. Swedzinski.
I also want to thank you all for taking the time out this evening to join us here during this debate. I think good debate is always the best part of our democracy, where we can all stand up and ask questions of one another and see where we stand on the issues. I look back from my I did take one class here at SMSU, and it was a summer course. And those days are just valuable when you take a look at what an institution like Southwest State can do and what it means in our region. I just want to congratulate the Political Science Department for putting on a great event tonight, and I look forward to a good debate. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Swedzinski. We now move to questions from our panel. Candidates, you'll have up to 90 seconds to respond to each question, and you can use less if you wish. We'll alternate the order in which you respond. And let me just pause to make the audience aware that the questions that you saw in the first round of the debate, you'll also see in the second round of debate. Both questions are relevant to both races. With that being said, the first question, please. And we'll have Mr. Kruse respond first.
If elected, what is your top priority for the 2013 session?
To balance the budget, we need to make structural changes in our tax system and our tax code so that we can increase revenues. One of the things that I would propose doing is to collect the sales tax that's due currently on internet sales that's not collected. People are supposed to voluntarily send it in, and we need to make sure that that's collected by the companies so that we have that revenue. We need to make the tax code more fair and efficient so that the middle class is not carrying most of the burden of the tax system. I see nothing wrong with asking those who benefit most in our economy to contribute back. It seems to be the democratic way, the fair way to do it. I want to make sure that education is funded, that we don't borrow from our schools, that post-secondary education is properly funded so that we can have a system where our students can have a current education that's applicable to the job climate, so that we can have people trained in not only in four-year education but also in vocational technical institutes. We need those people to be available to take a lot of the jobs that are coming up in our economy.
Thank you, Mr. Kruse. Mr. Swedzinski, your response, please.
My first goal, when you visit with college students and you look around the countryside, we do have an extremely low unemployment rate when you look at the national average. But you still have folks that are underemployed, folks that are out of work, folks that are struggling to make ends meet. I think when we're looking at what it means in an economy to get people back to work, focusing on jobs and growing our economy here in the state, we're looking, I believe in a balanced approach when it comes to solving the budget issues in our state, but not looking at taxation, really looking at the fundamental issues of growing an economy. We need to put investment into our state. Just in 2008, the amount of the U.S. GDP that was going into investment was 3%. Now it's 1.7. So we've got a fundamental structural deficiency when people don't understand what's going to come. We don't have a lot of, when we're looking at our national budget, all the national issues we're facing with our finances, that puts a question in business owners' minds and employers' minds when it comes to making and growing roots right here in our state. And so we need to support candidates at the national level that have a strong business sense, but also here at the state level, looking at growing jobs, focusing on what government does and how it does business to really try to streamline that effort. I really think is fundamentally what we need to do. We need to compete. We need to compete in our region. In order to do that, we're going to have to really look at what we do and not stand for the status quo.
Thank you, Mr. Swedzinski. Next question, panelists.
10 plus years ago, Minnesota passed Minnesota Care to help our low-income Minnesotans with health care. It was a bridge after Medicare that passed with bipartisan support and signed into law by Governor Arne Carlson. Do you support continuing and strengthening Minnesota Care?
Mr. Swedzinski, this is your question.
Thank you. That's a good question. I think we need to look at all ways. Healthcare is one of the fastest growing portions of cost when it comes to government. Look at entitlement reform across the nation. Right now, we currently spend about $2 trillion on entitlements. In 5 years, that's going to grow to $2.8 trillion. So when we're dealing with costs, it isn't simply just looking for ways to shift cost from individuals to government. We're seeing what the issues are with that. I mean, simply you cannot shift cost to government. We need to find and refine ways to look at how do we fundamentally make healthcare cost less. How do we go after tort reform? How do we go after those other issues? One of the subjects we took up in last session was we have a nation-leading reform, looking at low-income single individuals that are don't have insurance, that are either in Medicare or some sort of a state-sponsored program. We give them a voucher, and they can go out and buy private insurance. And through that program, it's very small. It's one of the first in the nation to try this. But really, in that small, we're looking to save $9 million just in a very small pilot project type program. And I believe when there's competition, whatever you see government involved in anything, it's hard to control costs because those real cost drivers are not there. So looking at trying to integrate, public and private partnerships through that, a system like that, I think are ways that we can really help maintain a system that is truly overburdened. So,
thank you, Mr. Swedzinski. Mr. Kruse, your response, please.
Well, a voucher system does just that. It shifts the cost of insurance from the government to the individual. And what happens is the individual has a cost that they can't maintain. We've talked to individuals who did not qualify for Minnesota Care. They couldn't find insurance that they could afford with less than a $10,000 deductible. That's not sustainable. They're one sickness or illness from poverty. There's an individual who's on a city council in a city north of here who was injured, had a back injury. It was determined to not be on the job, so he didn't qualify for workers' comp. He couldn't get insurance because now he has a pre-existing condition. So he went to the chiropractor, and that was all he could afford, and the chiropractor happened to be a relative, so he got a reduced rate for his chiropractic visits. But he suffered through that, and he was one payment from losing his house. We can't continue to shift the cost of health care onto the individuals like that. That's not containing costs. We need to do things that really reduce costs. We need to look at efficiencies like the Mayo Clinic system. We need to extend Minnesota Care. It's very efficient. It's like Medicare. It has low overhead and low delivery cost and high benefit. So I'm in favor of expanding Minnesota Care.
Thank you, Mr. Kruse. Next question, please.
Please indicate your level of support for tobacco control and prevention, specifically protecting and defending Minnesota's smoke-free law, classifying little cigars as cigarettes, and increasing the price of tobacco.
Mr. Kruse, you have this question.
I remember when I first came to Southwest, cigarettes were about 19 cents a pack, and the guy down the hall said, I'm going to quit when they hit a quarter. Well, they hit a quarter, and he didn't quit. He says, I'm going to quit when they hit 50 cents, and they didn't quit. It was $1, and he didn't quit. So, but it's been proven that cost of these little cigarettes or the little tobacco items that entice children or young people is a deterring factor. If we raise the tax on these items, right now the little cigars are not, we can increase the cost and make them less acceptable. The tobacco companies act like they don't market these to kids, but they come in flavors like grape and strawberry, and so you know they're marketing to kids. Tobacco causes the most preventable illnesses and costs to insurance of anything we have in this society. If we can prevent our young people from getting addicted to tobacco, and if that involves reclassifying and increasing the tax on it, increasing the price, I'm all for it. I like to be in an environment where there isn't smoke. I've had the argument many times within extended family members about whose right it is. I mean, the smoking is legal, and yes, smoking is legal, but the air is unpolluted as much as nature allows, and I like to keep it that way.
Thank you. Mr. Swedzinski, your response, please.
Well, when it comes to tobacco law, when it first came through, I obviously wasn't in the legislature. I didn't agree with changing law. I thought it should be a personal choice when it comes to a business owner, whether they have tobacco use in their facility or not. We do live in that world, and from what I've been able to tell, it's been a fairly positive change that we've made. On campus, I know there's been some talk about changing tobacco law. I think when we're looking at taxes, we're looking at trying to increase the price to decrease use. Those things work, fundamentally because it works just in business as well. If you want to discourage activity, tax it. And when it comes to tobacco use, I've seen some studies, I think in New York, that have tried to really raise the price of a pack of cigarettes precipitously. And what they've seen, you have three things in government. You can, if you go after someone, it's either going to be flight, or fraud. And so what they're seeing is a huge increase in the black market when it comes to the tobacco sales. And so there is a happy medium you have to find to try to get the greatest, you don't want people smoking. It's poor decision when it comes to health. But also, at what point are you going to have people go to Flandreau, South Dakota, which I have a lot of folks that I know go there to buy cigarettes. So if you're just going to move the product and you're going to move those things over, when they go and do commerce in South Dakota, that is not adding to our economy, and it's kind of a mix. So.
Thank you, Mr. Swedzinski. Next question, please.
Does Minnesota need stricter gun control laws?
And Mr. Swedzinski, this is your question.
No. I believe, when we're talking about gun control in the United States, it's a fundamental right that we have. It's the Second Amendment. When we're looking at, these issues that we're having across this country, and it's just a sad, sad situation. Oftentimes, I believe an armed person that is a law-abiding person is a benefit to society. It's oftentimes you have folks that are have some sort of issue that are creating tragedy all across the nation. But to use those situations to pass restrictive gun laws, I think is taking advantage of a situation. I believe that in a large part, whether it be a campus shooting or whatnot, a lot of those things could have been nullified or taken care of if we had little opener gun laws in the state.
Thank you. Mr. Kruse, your response, please.
I don't know that we need stricter gun laws. I certainly don't have any problem with people hunting. I'm not a hunter, but I do have guns. I respect the Second Amendment rights. I think that's an issue that we can argue about extensively. I do have a problem with some of the regulations on gun shows and things like that, that there could be a better enforcement of laws in those regards so that you don't have people slipping through the system. But I also understand that there's a black market for guns and they move pretty freely that way too. But I don't see a need for people beyond collectors to have AK-47s with extended clips where they can essentially arm themselves to the point where they could go into a theater with night goggles and kill everybody in the place. we need to do a better job of screening individuals who buy guns. We need to do a better job of enforcing the laws that we have. And we need a common sense approach in dealing, in training. We used to have people, you know, that grew up in a rural society and it was common to have a gun. You went hunting with your dad or your uncle and people learned basic safety. We don't live in that environment anymore. We don't have that. There's not that natural progression of grandfather teaching grandson or whatever. So we do need to take a common sense approach and figure it out, and we can. We can.
Thank you. Next question, please.
If the Marshall sales tax ballot question passes to support the local merit center and amateur sports center, will you support efforts to gain state funding to further support these projects?
And Mr. Kruse, this is your question.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's good for the community, it's good for the region, and I will absolutely carry a bill to apply for bonding money from the state to help do the construction. I will absolutely work to have hearings. I will absolutely vote for passage. I think that it's such a good project. It's going to bring people to the community. It's going to increase our tax base, our draw, our sales draw. It's absolutely a good project. It should have been in an expanded bill before because we have such low interest rates. We just need to do it. It just has to happen.
Mr. Swedzinski, your response.
Yes, I believe it's a legislator's responsibility when a city or a group within the district passes that through referendum and the people speak. It's a duty for the legislator to do their job and carry that bill. From a bonding approach, I think that's going to be a key portion for that project. So yes, I carried it in the last session, and we'll go after it again. So,
thank you. Next question, please.
We'll shift gears to education. How would you advocate repaying the money borrowed from public schools this past biennium?
Mr. Swedzinski, this is your question.
Yes, part of the last budget in 2011, the legislature borrowed about $700 million from the schools. So the current, I believe it was at a 60 or 70-30. So 70% of the funds were deployed prior to the last legislative session. It was 90-10 from the session prior to that, so it was at a 90-10 level from 2009-2010. And then in 2011, we changed it from to a 70-30. So we moved it down. That's where it was at, and we moved it to a 60-40 school shift. That was approximately $700 million. Because of the budget that we passed and the reforms that we were able to find within government, we paid back before the session was even over and are still looking to pay more than likely the rest of it off when the next budget report comes in. We voted to pay $318 million of that school shift back. And then beyond that, we were also at the point when we had the $6 billion shortfall. To clarify what was earlier said, there was no money in the money account or the cash reserves, so we didn't raid that and spend that as well. We were left with zero in those reserve accounts, and so we also built those up to over $1 billion, and then voted to spend $400 million of that to pay the entire shift back. And looking at other ways, we were approximately looking at using other surpluses to pay the rest back. I'm out of time. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Swedzinski. Mr. Kruse, your response, please.
Well, there's a $2.4 billion figure that seems to be agreed on. It seems to be in all the newspapers and on the news that we owe to the schools. And we do need to figure out how to pay that back. And I do understand that the previous governor raided the cash reserves accounts, so there wasn't any money in there to take money out of. And I also understand that Governor Dayton was within his rights in the law to prevent the vote from what they called the payback of the schools to fill and refund the reserve accounts and the cash flow accounts. So that was proper. We need to look at enhanced revenues in the state. And I agree that more jobs creates more revenue. I think, you know, I go along with people that I've talked to that have an economics background that say we should be robustly bonding with the interest rates so low to create jobs. And those jobs will enhance our tax revenues and increase our take. We also need to close loopholes on companies that are putting money overseas and not reporting it here in Minnesota. We need to collect the tax revenue on internet sales. We need to look at other sources of revenue. We can't just say we have a spending problem, because we have a revenue problem. Our revenue is down.
Thank you, Mr. Kruse. Next question, please.
What can the legislature do to decrease college tuition and debt?
And Mr. Kruse, this is your question.
I think it's still a law on the books. Minnesota, the state of Minnesota, is supposed to fund 67% of the cost of an institution like Southwest. Tuition is supposed to make up the other 33%. We have flipped that. So we need to properly fund post-secondary education. Southwest State is, I believe the figure is $10 million less in the last decade than they had. We have more students attending Southwest. Our costs are up. Our labor situation is down. Support staff, if somebody retires, they don't get replaced. They just work more. We can't continue to do that. That's not sustainable. We need to get the state involved and get back into that funding level where we are supporting the cost of education. It's a good investment. It's a good investment. It creates educated workforce, which along with roads and bridges are the two big things that make Minnesota business friendly. We used to be number one or number two in education and tops in roads, and that made Minnesota the state that was home to more Fortune 500 companies than any other place on earth. We need to get back to that.
Thank you, Mr. Kruse. Mrs. Swedzinski, your response.
Well, I think, you know, we did have to do some reductions in the last session when it came to higher education. You know, when visiting on campus with students, a lot of the issues that they're bringing forth are, one, what am I going to do after I graduate, and two, the cost of textbooks. You know, there are a number of avenues of costs when it comes to higher education. We've got a whole system, I believe a budget of about $62 million in St. Paul that doesn't educate a single student. You know, that is a big issue. And it's, you know, when it comes to higher ed finance, I find that it's kind of, if you've ever been to a carnival and you've seen these, or even at a parade, which I think Al and I have both been to too many of those this summer, but you know, you've got these clowns on the side of the street, and they've got these balloons that they can turn into different animals. You squeeze one end and the air moves to the other. Well, that's the same issue when we're dealing with higher ed. We're trying to go after administration up in St. Paul that aren't feet on the ground people teaching students, educating students, and trying to look at ways to reform the way they do business. They simply squeeze the balloon, and the responsibility goes back down to the campus. We look over here, and then it goes back up. And also trying to do some textbook reform. You know, a $400 economics textbook that can only be used at Southwest State, I believe is unacceptable. We did look at finding ways to have a little more transparency between professor and student when it comes to what textbooks are going to be selected and if old editions would potentially work. You know, those are all, and also funding work programs and some of those things I think are good priorities. So,
This is the 2012 Legislative Candidates Debate coming to you live from Southwest Minnesota State University over KMHL, AM 1400 in Marshall, and on KSSU TV. I think we can take our next question.
What is your opinion of the no tax increase pledge to Grover Norquist?
And Mr. Swedzinski, this is your question.
Well, I believe, you know, I didn't sign it to go over Norquist. I did sign it, a tax pledge to a tax foundation, tax organizations, even within the state. You know, I believe that the voters should know exactly where you stand. And, you on any issue. And taxes are an extremely important part of our economy. They have a drastic effect on the way we do business in our state. And I felt as a person running for public office, I should let people know exactly where I stand on it. I did sign it with a caveat that, looking at the fundamental need for general reform and recalculation of taxes, that may mean that in the next few years that we maybe not increase total revenue to government, but re-look at the way we do taxes. So a total reform of the system. That's one of the biggest issues we have in the state when it comes just to property taxes. We've got property taxes that have over 55 different definitions. In South Dakota, we have one with 8. So just a simplification of tax code. I mean, we're going to have to look at new ways of doing business because we spend billions and billions of dollars nationwide on the simple trying to adhere to tax law. Looking at tax analytics, just simply trying to collect, as Al mentioned, taxes that are due are another way. So yeah, that's what I think of.
Thank you, Mr. Swedzinski. Mr. Kruse, your response, please.
Well, I think signing a pledge to Grover Norquist, saying I will not raise taxes under any circumstances, ties one hand behind your back. I think there are situations that may call for an increased need for revenue. If you've pledged yourself to no taxes under any circumstances, how do you deal with emergencies? How do you deal with natural disasters? You have to go back to the legislature and say, okay, we can't increase revenue, so we have to cut education, and we have to cut roads, and we have to cut this and this so that we can fund the needed money for a disaster. We can't go into the legislature that way. That pledge has prevented too many people from even sitting down and talking about reasonable tax revenue. It prevents people from even talking about tax reform because their attitude is, we can't reform taxes if it increases revenue. And the state needs revenue. Investing in our education system in colleges and post-secondary is an investment. It's an investment that pays off. Investment in early childhood development programs comes back to us 15 to 1. You don't get a better return than that. If we don't have the revenue, how do we do it? All we can do is cut. We've been cutting since 1997.
Thank you, Mr. Kruse. I think we're ready for our next question.
There are thousands of veterans in Minnesota. Do you have any propositions to ensure that they continue to receive the benefits they are entitled to, or to expand benefits or entitlements in Minnesota?
And Mr. Kruse, this is your question.
If we send our treasurer, our young people to war, we have an obligation to them for the rest of their lives. We cannot back away from that obligation. If we send them to war, into harm's way, we need to have some kind of a support system for them for the rest of their lives. What happened to the Vietnam veterans having to fight for Agent Orange benefits was unconscionable. We have been treating our Gulf War and our Iraq and Afghanistan veterans better, and thank God that we are, because we have an obligation, a moral obligation. And that leads to, what do we do with taxes and revenue also? Because it costs money. We have no idea how much it's going to cost us to take care of these veterans that are coming back with post-traumatic distress disorder, maimings, lost limbs, psychological problems. We have no idea how much it's going to cost us. And if we restrict our ability to have revenue, how will we deal with it?
Thank you, Mr. Kruse. Mrs. Swedzinski, your response.
Well, I think as Republicans and Democrats, support for veterans is probably one of the most bipartisan issues at the Capitol. Last session, we were able to move some good pieces forward to support veterans and veteran services. We had some good money put forward to assist county veteran service officers for one-time grants to seek and find some programming. We also put some legislation forward so if a business owner wanted to give preference to a veteran that was returning from their service or had past service in the military, that they could give preference to hiring that veteran without being sued or having the thought of being sued beneath them. And on top of that, we also tried to get some tax credits for business owners to hire veterans, some incentives programs, and also within the transportation industry, gave a 6% preference to transportation projects for construction companies that were owned by a veteran. So those were some of the things that we did to support, as we're looking at so many people coming back from theaters of war that are unemployed or looking for work, or, we have current laws that you can't be fired from a job when you leave, but if that business is no longer there, you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. And so looking for unique ways to really serve those folks that really sacrifice a lot for what we enjoy here, I think is a small price. So,
Thank you. Mr. Kruse? Oh, pardon me. Next question, please.
Would you support more tax on gas and a new tax on electric cars as a way to improve roads and bridges?
And now, Mr. Swedzinski, your response.
Well, if you look at the pump, folks one of the biggest things I hear at doors are people complaining about the price of gas. And, I think our infrastructures in driving and roads are one of the most critical things that we can do as a state. I believe that we need to go towards a tax solution. We need to go to how do we build those. So when we're looking at county projects and we're looking at local road projects, what are the costs and where do they get interceded? I know of projects within the counties where it's a 6-mile long project and $300,000 of it is to put tarps along the side of the road. Is that the best use? We want to protect our waterways, but if this is about rebuilding our infrastructure in a core way, we need to get people to drive more. We need to put more miles on the road. At $3.50 gas, I think most folks that have places up north are visiting them less. There's less disposable income nationwide. For every cent that gasoline prices go up nationwide, it's $1 billion out of the disposable incomes of Americans. And in this time of recession, putting increased costs, especially at the state, we have important projects that we need to look at. I agree that making further stands within the bonding bill for roads and bridges is a commitment we need to make as legislators. It's awfully ugly, doing roads and bridges. It's not a pretty project that we can all look at, but it's all things that we really need. So.
Thank you. Mr. Kruse, your response.
A number of years back, Representative Magnus from Slayton carried the Minnesota Moves bill, and I went to the Capitol on Legislative Day and lobbied with Mr. Magnus, and he told me in that meeting with a lot of chamber members that we really should raise our gas tax 16 cents. But he says we're going to get lucky to raise it 6. He carried the bill and he voted against it. We had people who were disciplined for crossing party lines and voting to raise the gas tax 5 cents to begin with and an 8-cent total. And this is 4 years after Mr. Magnus said we should be raising it 16 cents. So we've never put the gas tax to index it to inflation. And that's one of the things that we need to do. The gas tax will never cover the whole cost of roads and bridges, but roads and bridges are one of the legs that make us business friendly. We used to have some of the best roads and bridges in the country until we made national news with one of our bridges falling down. And then we scrambled and we got national money to rebuild it. But we need to find a solution, and part of that is raising the gas tax. Part of it is maybe looking at a wheelage tax. Part of it is looking at ways that we can enhance our roads and bridges, how we can get the revenue to do that. We all benefit from roads and bridges, and we need to step forward and find a way to fund that fairly.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Do the candidates support Obamacare or support the repeal of Obamacare?
Mr. Kruse, you have this question.
I prefer to call it the Affordable Health Care Act, but Obamacare, he's embraced it, and I am all for it. It's not perfect. It's absolutely not perfect. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it is a start. And we need to start somewhere. We can't just keep kicking this can down the road. Medicare is admittedly one of the most efficient programs, healthcare programs that exist. It has low administrative cost and high benefit. My parents both benefited from Medicare. My mother still does. I have many friends that benefit from Medicare. Now, Obamacare has put more money into the fraud division, and they are recapturing a lot of money that's going away to fraud. And that's one of the things we need to eliminate is fraud in healthcare. My insurance agent told me one day, her sister was a registered nurse, and her husband was dying of cancer, and she says, I looked through the bill and I couldn't figure it out, and my sister looked at it and she says, why are you being billed for this thing twice? And they went through all the bills, and time after time after time, they were being overbilled by the medical system, by the doctors and the hospitals. And so we need to look at fraud within it, but I think it's a great start. I think it's a great start. We need Medicare for everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Swedzinski. Your response, please.
Well, I think this has been an argument that's been going on since for 60 plus years in the United States, looking at a healthcare system that would be beneficial to a lot of people. Obamacare, as we call it, was sold to the American people to cost about $1 trillion, under $1 trillion, $998 billion or whatever it was sold to. Now that we're getting through it, we're looking at a bill that costs about 3 times as much. You know, we as a country need to take a collective breath and look at what we are doing in our national debt, our national consciousness. You know, what are we passing on to the next generation? I'm saying there needs to be reform within the healthcare system, but we also need to have responsibility when it comes to as Americans, that we are not going to spend money that we do not have, and we do not have money for this type of program. We need to look at efficiencies within the healthcare system. You've talked to folks within the healthcare system, they are looking for someone that can be a payer. And we need to find ways to lessen the cost. So we need to look at ways for tort reform so that folks that are delivering babies, if they get sued, there aren't going to be literally millions of dollars taken out of their bottom line. As far as, we have providers also that have been sued for $22 million for one bad procedure, literally wiping out tens of years of profitability, and it's not going to decrease the cost. And we need to look at getting these things under control, and I don't believe that that's going to solve it. So,
thank you. Next question, please.
How would you reform LGA to benefit small rural communities?
And Mr. Swedzinski, this is your question.
Well, one of the big things we have at the state legislature is LGA and its participation with a lot of our small cities and towns. We've got a lot of towns that one of their biggest portions of their budget is LGA. One of the bills that I particularly carried in the last session, we had a few small towns within our neck of the woods that didn't get their paperwork done in time, and so that they were at risk of losing their LGA, which was, I think, 25% of their total budget. So we really looked at understanding. There's a whole budget process. They need to go through an audit as far as small towns. I think for small towns whose audit costs about as much as what they receive in LGA, there should be some waivers when it comes to some of those requirements. LGA has been a program that has had ups and downs. We were able to solidify spending in LGA from 2010 levels. We were able to keep it at the same in 2011, 2012. And because of the census, One of the things that came up and through the legislature is that a lot of our small cities and towns under 5,000 were looking to really take a big hit because they simply lost population. Those are one of the biggest issues we're facing with our small cities and towns is we have less people living in them. And that was going to have an adverse effect as far as with their LGA. And so we were able to work with Governor Dayton and find a solution to really try to hold the gap when it comes to funding for some of those small towns into 2013 so that they weren't going to see a drastic reduction in LGA simply because of population declines.
Thank you. Mr. Kruse, your response, please.
LGA is a major portion of the budget for too many small towns. It's a redistribution of sales tax. Sales tax revenue has increased over the years. LGA has been cut. LGA is designed to help small towns and cities to provide services like sewer and water, sanitary sewer, library, fire department, those kinds of things. That's what the money goes to in these small towns. When you cut it, you cut the number of people that they have working. Now, I've heard people say that there's too many public employees, but when you are a small community and you have 2 public employees and your LGA gets cut and one of them has to go, did you have too many public employees because now your park doesn't get mowed and a lot of services decline? We need to re-look at LGA. LGA is an equalizer. It's like education is an equalizer for people. It's an opportunity so that people will continue to reside in these small communities. If we continue to cut the LGA, not only will they not have enough people to do their paperwork, they won't have anybody to make sure that the sewer and water works, that the snow is removed or the parks are mowed or whatever their services are, and people won't choose to live there. And we need to do everything we can to help these small towns be a place that people want to live. Otherwise, we lose our critical mass and we lose our opportunities for a workforce.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Back to the 2-part question on the proposed constitutional amendments in Minnesota. The first part, what is your stance on the amendments in general? And the second part of the question, please provide a personal view of the voter ID, marriage amendments. Are you for or against them?
Mr. Kruse, this is your question.
Government by constitutional amendment is bad government generally. As Ted explained, the Constitution defines how our government is supposed to work. The Constitution provides for enforcement or of rights and privileges that government cannot violate. A law is supposed to pass the House, the Senate, and be signed by the governor. A constitutional amendment runs an end run around that. So constitutional amendments should be passed to enhance rights, not take rights away. I can think of one constitutional amendment that took rights away on a national level, and that was prohibition. And it wasn't too long before we decided that, hey, this isn't working, we better get rid of it. Only we're stuck with the results of it to this day. We developed organized crime, and we can't get rid of it. So let's not do something to our Constitution that prevents future legislators from passing reasonable legislation. Voter ID is a solution in search of a problem. People do not go to the polls on any kind of a regular basis and try to vote as somebody else. It just doesn't happen. Most of it is felons who don't realize that their rights haven't been restored and they can't vote. There are so few cases. If we did a cost analysis, it takes 6 deaths at a corner to get a semaphore. We're spending millions of dollars for a problem that doesn't exist. About 13 cases in the nation. It's not worth it for either of them.
Thank you. Mr. Swedzinski, your response, please.
I am in support of both the voter ID and marriage amendment. I believe that, the people is not going for a vote for the people is not an end round. around the process. You know, whenever, I mean, these are two issues that are in our national consciousness, the marriage amendment and voter ID. These conversations are happening. And, you know, I believe that, you know, whenever you go to the people and you engage them, you know, we are elected to represent the people. And these are issues that have been brought up day after day, door after door. And these are important. These are passionate issues. You know, people say, well, these are divisive. Well, we have people of different ideas when it comes to these things. And, you know, when we're looking from a bill standpoint, you know, voter ID, when we had it in a bill structure, we have to do costs, what the bill's going to cost, and it was estimated it was about a $4.5 million cost, voter ID for implementation as a statute. And, you know, looking at, you know, from a cost standpoint, you know, I agree that those are things that need to be handled from the state if there are costs not getting pushed down to the local units of government. And so I'm in support of both amendments.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question and then closing remarks. So please, one more question.
People are still struggling with underwater mortgages and foreclosures. What are your perspectives on this issue in your district, and what do you think needs to happen to alleviate this?
Mr. Swedzinski, this is your question.
Could you what was the second, underwater mortgages and what?
People are still struggling with underwater mortgages and foreclosures.
Foreclosures.
What are your perspectives on this issue in your district, and what do you think needs to happen to alleviate this?
Well, I mean, you know, we've had a credit bubble in our country. You know, we've had a dot-com bubble, we've had a housing bubble, and we're still dealing with the aftermath of government involvement when it comes to home loans. You know, fundamentally driving that. You know, that was a Republican and a Democrat issue, whether it be Barney Frank or President Bush. You know, pushing that. You know, there's nothing more fundamental than owning a home. But the biggest also issue is, where did the money come from? How did it get dispersed? Were the fundamentals there for making a loan? You know, and all those rules changed in the last 10 years. You know, fundamentally, if you're underwater in your mortgage, you know, that is something probably out of your control. You know, market forces within your city are dictating whether or not what the value of your home is. You know, so if you're underwater, that means you owe more than your home is worth. You know, and sad to say, when government-produced bubbles occur, that happens. And, you know, the issues with foreclosure, you know, a job. A job is how you solve those issues. You know, there's a lot of people, for as many people that are not making their payment, there are twice as many that are making it. And if you fundamentally have a job, or you have an opportunity to grow in that job and make more money, you know, from a city standpoint, if you want taxpayers, you need to have a job in town. If you don't have a job in town, you're not going to live in town. If you don't live in town, you're not going to buy a home in town. If you don't have a home in town, you're probably not going to raise your family and send your kids to school. You know, when we're dealing with our small cities and towns, that is a fundamental issue, that we have declining populations in southwest Minnesota. We need to do things that are going to attract jobs, to keep property values up, to keep kids in our school, and to keep food on families' tables.
Thank you. Mr. Kruse, your response?
You're talking about this district, isn't that what the question said?
That was the question, yes.
I think we've been pretty lucky out here for the most part. I mean, talking to realtors, they say that houses are selling pretty good. So I don't know how big a problem it is out here. I think there are many people that bought too much house for what they could afford because of the way things were going. You could buy a house, you could live in it for 3 years, you could sell it for more than what you paid for it, you could leverage that into a house that cost even more, et cetera, and then it crashed. The loans, the situations that I have empathy for and I think we need to really deal with are those people who weren't trying to do that. That they bought a home, they had 2 jobs, they could afford their home, the market crashed, one of them lost their job or maybe both, and the jobs that they now have don't give them the same ability to pay. Their home is worth less. The banks aren't working with them. We bailed banks out. The banks need to work with their mortgagees. It's to their benefit to have somebody paying a mortgage. You know, we wrote their bill down. it seems fair to me that maybe they should write some bills down too, instead of giving bonuses to their CEOs and brokers, et cetera. I don't have a solution other than we need, definitely, I agree with Chris, we need more jobs. And I think if I go to the legislature, we'll create a situation where we can do that.
Thank you. Panelists and candidates, it's now time for closing statements, which will be given in reverse order of our opening remarks. Mr. Swedzinski, your 2-minute closing statement, please.
Thank you. Thank you again for coming tonight. It has been an absolute honor to serve the constituents of House District 21A for the last 2 years in St. Paul. I live, just a brief rundown, I didn't do a proper job of introducing myself, but I live just outside of Ghent with my wife Jessica and 3 children. I own a small welding business and I farm. I believe, small business entrepreneurship is what built this country. It's what's going to get our nation back on its feet. And, whatever we can do as state legislators to grow jobs and grow our economy within our state is really, truly going to get us in the right direction. When it comes to, folks that are in control, local folks are usually going to make the best decisions, whether they be parents or teachers or school boards or principals. When it comes to education of their kids, looking for ways to truly empower those folks from the state level, really pushing as much influence out and grabbing as much influence out of St. Paul and pushing as much influence out is what we really need to do and what needs to be our strive and goal as a state legislator. I appreciate the time you've all taken to come out tonight. It's been an honor to serve, and I look forward to working with you, and I'd appreciate your vote in November.
Thank you, Mr. Swedzinski. Mr. Kruse, your closing statement, please.
Thank you for all of you for attending this forum, and thank you for those of you who are watching on TV or listening on the radio. I hope it's been informative for you. I have some basic fundamental beliefs about how to make Minnesota work again. I believe that education is the most important. I believe that the first thing is we need to invest in women, infant, and children's programs. We need healthy children. We need children to be ready for kindergarten. Those dollars come back to us 15-1. There is no better investment that we can make. They need health care. We need every child reading at grade level by grade 3. If they are reading at grade level in grade 3, the rest of their education will be so much easier. We won't have an achievement gap if we can do that. We need to stop over-regulating our schools. We need to stop burdening them with paperwork. We need to let teachers teach. We need every child to have an education to the best of their ability, not to pass a test. If we believe that every citizen has worth, then we need to educate every student to the best of their ability. Not everyone is cut out for college. So we need to re-examine our vocational education system. It costs money. The only way to reduce the tuition cost is for us to pay more of the overhead cost. We can't keep putting that on the student. We need to bond for our roads and bridges. We need to invest in our infrastructure. That will create private sector jobs. Road construction is private sector. Trades jobs are private sector. It's a government investment, but they don't care where the dollar comes from. But it's a dollar that we will get many, many returns on. How many of you have walked down the sidewalk and to this day there is concrete with the letters WPA or CCC? We need to do that again and get this country working.
This concludes our debate for House District 16A. Our thanks to the candidates Al Kruse and Chris Swedzinski. I'm Douglas Simon, and I've been your moderator for this debate. Tonight's program has been sponsored by the Southwest Minnesota State University Political Science Association and the Marshall Area Chamber of Commerce. The sponsors wish to thank KMHL Radio, the SMSU Radio TV Club, and the National Broadcasting Society for making our broadcast possible. From the Conference Center on the campus of Southwest Minnesota State University, this has been the 2012 Legislative Candidate Debate. Thank you for joining us, and be sure to vote on Tuesday, November 6th. Have a good evening.